I suspected my wife was planning a divorce, so I moved my assets. 2 weeks later, she filed. Then her plan backfired completely. Before we get into today's story, if you enjoy these real-life tales of betrayal, redemption, and karma, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. It costs nothing, takes 2 seconds, and it's the single biggest reason we're able to keep bringing you stories like this one. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and if you've ever had a gut feeling about someone that turned out to be dead right, let us know that too. Alright, let's get into it. I never thought I'd be the guy writing one of these stories. I always figured infidelity, betrayal, secret plans to destroy a marriage, that was something that happened to other people, the kind of drama you read about and think, that could never be me. I was wrong. And what happened to me over the course of about 2 months changed the way I think about trust, marriage, and my own instincts forever. The marriage that worked. My wife, I'll call her Claire, and I were together for 7 years, married for 5. On paper and in practice, we were solid. We weren't the couple who never fought, we argued about normal things, dumb things, whose turn it was to do dishes, which route to take on road trips, whether to get a dog. But none of it ever felt like a crack in the foundation. It felt like 2 people who knew how to disagree without it meaning anything was actually wrong. We had our rhythms. She'd planned these elaborate little date nights every few months, complete with a theme and a playlist, and I'd surprise her with her favorite Thai food on nights she'd had a brutal day at work. We had inside jokes that had lasted so long neither of us remembered how they started anymore. When people asked us how we made it work, my honest answer was always the same: we just liked each other. Not just loved, liked. We wanted to spend time together. That's rarer than people think. So when I say I never saw this coming, I mean it. There was no dramatic fight, no obvious betrayal, no single moment where the wheels came off. It was slow. It was quiet. And if I hadn't happened to notice a handful of small, strange things, I honestly don't know if I ever would have seen it until it was too late. Looking back now, I can trace the timeline almost to the week. But at the time, none of it felt connected. It just felt like life. Like the natural texture of a long marriage, where things ebb and flow and you don't panic every time something feels slightly different than it did last month. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. I wasn't a paranoid husband hunting for problems. I was a guy who loved his wife and assumed the best, right up until the evidence stopped letting me. The shift. It started about 5 months before everything came to a head, with something so small I almost laughed at myself for noticing it. Claire started keeping her phone with her constantly. Not just at her desk or on the nightstand, I mean everywhere. To the bathroom. To get the mail. While she cooked dinner. Before this, her phone had lived on the kitchen counter for hours at a time, face up, unlocked half the time. She never cared who saw it. Suddenly, it never left her hand. I made a joke about it once, something like, "What, are you running a secret double life now?" She laughed, a little too quickly, I thought later, and said work had been emailing her nonstop about some new client account. Fine. Reasonable. I let it go. Then came the password. Her phone had never had a lock screen in 5 years of marriage. One evening I picked it up to check the time and it asked me for a 4-digit code. When I asked her about it, half joking, she gave me this vague answer about identity theft being on the rise and wanting to be careful. It wasn't a crazy explanation. Lots of people lock their phones. But the timing, paired with everything else, planted a small seed of unease that I couldn't quite shake. After that, the phone calls started. She'd never been someone who took calls in another room. We'd built our whole life around an open-door policy, nothing hidden, nothing whispered. Now her phone would buzz and she'd say, "Let me just take this real quick," before disappearing into the bedroom or stepping out onto the back porch. When I'd ask who it was afterward, the answer was almost always the same 3 words, "Just a friend." I noticed her keeping the phone face down on tables, something she'd never done before. Once I reached over to hand her a glass of water and she snatched the phone away so fast it nearly clattered off the counter. She laughed it off, said she was just being clumsy, but I saw the flash of panic in her eyes before she covered it. And then there was the distance. Conversations that used to flow, about our future, about small logistics, about nothing at all, started feeling like work. If I brought up our anniversary trip or asked whether we should finally replace the aging car, she'd give this flat, non-committal "yeah, we'll see" and change the subject almost immediately. It wasn't hostile. It was worse than hostile. It was indifferent, like she was mentally somewhere else entirely and just going through the motions of being present with me. None of these things, on their own, meant anything. People get busy. People get private. People change their habits for 100 boring reasons that have nothing to do with an affair or a divorce plot. But stacked together, week after week, they started to form a shape I didn't like. The coffee that wasn't coffee. The moment that really cracked things open for me happened on an ordinary Wednesday. Claire mentioned she was grabbing coffee with a friend after work, nothing unusual, she did this from time to time. I happened to be running errands near the same part of town, and on a whim, I thought I'd swing by and surprise her. It felt sweet in my head. In reality, it turned into the moment everything started to unravel. When I pulled up near the cafe, she wasn't inside with a friend. She was standing on the sidewalk out front, pacing, phone pressed to her ear, clearly deep in a conversation that looked anything but casual. I didn't get out of the car. Something about her posture, tense shoulders, quick, clipped movements, told me this wasn't a friend venting about her boyfriend. I sat there, engine off, and caught fragments of what she was saying through the open window of my car. Phrases like "it's almost ready" and "we can start fresh soon" drifted over. I had no context for what she meant, but it didn't sound like small talk. It sounded like a plan. When she got home that night, I asked how her coffee date went, keeping my voice as light as I could manage. She launched into this whole story about her friend's relationship troubles, a story that, in hindsight, felt suspiciously detailed for something she'd apparently just been venting about on a sidewalk 5 minutes earlier. I let it go. I didn't have proof of anything, just a bad feeling and a handful of overheard words that could have meant almost anything. A few days later, though, she brought up something that made the bad feeling sharpen into something closer to alarm. We were in the kitchen, and out of nowhere she said, we should really get all our account info and passwords organized. Just in case something happens. I asked what she meant by just in case, trying to sound casual. She gave me this rehearsed little shrug and said, emergencies. What if one of us gets sick, or we need to make a big decision fast? On the surface, it was reasonable. Responsible, even. Except we'd been married 5 years and never once discussed centralizing our financial information. We kept things loose, separate accounts for personal spending, one joint account for shared bills, and it had always worked fine. The sudden urgency to consolidate everything, paired with the phone secrecy and the strange phone call I'd overheard, didn't sit right with me. It felt less like practical planning and more like preparation for something she hadn't told me about yet. Following the money. The finances conversation came up again a few days later, this time more directly. I was making dinner, she was scrolling on her phone, and she asked, almost too casually, whether I'd thought any more about getting the bank stuff organized. I put the knife down and turned to face her. What's going on? I asked. You brought this up 3 times now. Is there something you need to tell me? She looked up, clearly caught off guard that I'd pushed back. Nothing's wrong, she said quickly. I just think it's smart, that's all. For emergencies. Emergencies like what? She shrugged again, wouldn't meet my eyes. I don't know. Just life stuff. It's not a big deal. It was a big deal. Or at least, the way she avoided giving me a straight answer made it feel like one. I nodded and dropped it in the moment, but that night I couldn't stop turning it over in my head. The vagueness wasn't like her. Claire was a direct person by nature. When something was on her mind, she usually said so, sometimes bluntly. This careful dodging felt like a performance. The next day, while she was at work, I logged into our joint account, something I rarely bothered doing since we both just trusted the numbers to make sense. They didn't. Over the previous month, there had been several small withdrawals, nothing dramatic, nothing that would trigger a fraud alert, but amounts that didn't correspond to any bill, subscription, or purchase I recognized. It wasn't the kind of spending pattern you'd expect from someone doing groceries or paying down a credit card. It looked deliberate. Like someone quietly siphoning cash out before doing something bigger. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I wanted to be sure I wasn't building a conspiracy out of coincidences, so I called an old college friend, Tom, who'd gone on to become a family law attorney. I laid it all out for him, the phone secrecy, the overheard call, the sudden interest in centralizing finances, the mystery withdrawals, trying to sound rational and not like a man spiraling into paranoia. Tom listened without interrupting, then gave me the kind of blunt, practical advice only a lawyer friend can give. "I'm not saying anything is definitely happening," he said. "But you're not crazy for wanting to protect yourself. If there's even a chance she's preparing for a divorce, and you do nothing, you could end up in a much worse position than you need to be in. Better to move early and be wrong than wait and be devastated." He walked me through what my options actually looked like: legal, above-board ways to protect assets that predated any filing, structured properly so they couldn't later be challenged as an attempt to hide marital property. It felt surreal hearing it laid out so clinically, like I was planning for the collapse of something I still, deep down, hoped wasn't collapsing at all. The decision. I want to be honest about how hard this decision was, because I think it's easy to hear "I moved my assets" and picture some cold, calculating guy plotting his next move like a chess player. That wasn't what this felt like from the inside. It felt like grief. Like I was mourning something that hadn't officially ended yet, but that I could feel slipping away in real time. I kept replaying memories that night: our wedding, the ridiculous nicknames we'd given each other in the first year of dating, the way she used to leave little notes in my lunch bag when we were both broke and stressed and somehow still happy. How had we gotten from that to me sitting at my desk at midnight, mapping out how to protect myself from the person I'd built my entire adult life around? But the more I sat with it, the more I understood that this wasn't really a betrayal of trust. It was a response to one. If nothing was actually wrong, moving assets into a protected structure wouldn't cost me anything. The money would still be mine, still available, still under my control in every practical sense. If something was wrong, though, and I did nothing, I could lose everything I'd worked for based on nothing but naive optimism. That asymmetry made the decision, painful as it was, feel necessary rather than paranoid. That evening, while Claire was out, I called my mother. I didn't tell her everything, just enough. "I need you to hold on to some things for me for a while," I said. "Nothing bad, just something I need to do to protect myself. Just in case." She went quiet for a moment, clearly sensing there was more to the story than I was sharing. "Are you okay?" she asked, worry threading through her voice. "Yeah," I told her, which wasn't entirely true. "It's just a precaution." She didn't push, but I could hear the concern sitting underneath her response. "Of course, sweetheart. Whatever you need." Hanging up that call left me with this strange cocktail of relief and guilt: relief that I had somewhere safe to put things, guilt that I was even in a position where I felt I needed to. Over the following days, working with Tom, I moved the bulk of our shared assets, savings, investment accounts, even the deed to the house, into a trust structured under my mother's name, fully legal, fully documented, time-stamped weeks before anything official happened on Claire's end. I left enough in our joint account to keep things looking normal: groceries, bills, the usual flow of money neither of us would think twice about. Claire noticed nothing. She came home that same week, kissed me on the cheek, asked if I wanted to watch something together, completely unaware that the financial architecture of our marriage had just fundamentally shifted. I smiled, sat down next to her, and felt like the emotional equivalent of a live wire. The waiting game. The 2 weeks that followed were some of the strangest of my life. I tried to maintain a normal routine, going to work, cooking dinner, keeping conversations light, all while carrying this enormous, invisible weight. Claire, meanwhile, seemed almost suspiciously content. She was cheerful, affectionate even, bringing up plans for the following month like nothing was wrong. Instead of putting me at ease, it made me more uneasy. If something was actually happening, this level of calm felt like the eye of a storm rather than clear skies. What stood out most was that she never brought up the finances again. Not once. Given how persistently she'd pushed the topic before, the silence felt loaded rather than reassuring. A few times I caught her watching me across the room with this searching, evaluative look, like she was trying to figure out whether I suspected anything. The moment I made eye contact, she'd look away and busy herself with her phone or the TV remote. Part of me started to second-guess everything. Maybe I really had built a narrative out of coincidences. Maybe the withdrawals had a boring explanation I hadn't thought of. Maybe the phone call outside the cafe really was about something mundane, work stress, a friend's crisis, anything but what my gut kept insisting it was. I almost called Tom to ask whether I'd overreacted, whether I should quietly reverse the transfers before Claire ever noticed they'd happened. I'm glad I didn't. On a Friday night near the end of those 2 weeks, Claire turned off the TV, sat me down on the couch, and said the 4 words that confirmed every instinct I'd been fighting to ignore. We need to talk. The announcement. I knew what was coming before she said it, the way you know a storm has arrived the moment before the thunder actually cracks. I think we should get a divorce, she said. Her voice wasn't angry or tearful. It was calm, measured, almost rehearsed, like she'd practiced saying it in the mirror. She talked about needing space, about feeling like she'd lost herself somewhere in the marriage, all the standard lines you'd expect from someone trying to justify an ending that had clearly been decided long before this conversation started. Then she said something that shifted the tone entirely. I've made a lot of sacrifices for you over the years, and I don't think you really appreciate that. I deserve more. That last part landed differently than the rest. It wasn't just an announcement that she wanted out, it was a framing, a narrative where I was somehow the villain who'd taken more than I'd given, and she was simply reclaiming what was rightfully hers. I sat with that for a second, turning it over. Sacrifices. What sacrifices, exactly? I thought back over 5 years of marriage and came up with the opposite pattern. When she wanted to move closer to her office, I'd agreed even though it tripled my commute. When she wanted to attend an expensive retreat the year before, I'd rearranged our budget to make it happen without complaint. When she decided to change careers, not once but twice, I'd backed her both times, told her to take the leap, that I wanted her to be happy even if it meant financial uncertainty for a while. I remembered birthdays, showed up for the boring stuff, listened when she vented about work or her family. I wasn't a perfect husband, nobody is, but unappreciative wasn't a fair read of the last 5 years, and deep down I think she knew that too. Then she added one more detail that cracked the whole thing open. A friend of mine has been helping me see things more clearly, she said, not quite meeting my eyes. A friend. The word landed like a stone in still water. Someone had been in her ear, shaping how she saw our marriage, feeding her this narrative of sacrifice and deserving more. This wasn't a woman who had simply fallen out of love. This was a woman who had been coached into a decision. I didn't push back in the moment. I nodded, said something non-committal about figuring out next steps, and let her think I was simply absorbing the blow quietly. In reality, my mind had already shifted gears entirely. I needed to know who this friend was, and I needed to know before her legal team made their first move. The papers arrived the following Monday, and they were far more aggressive than anything a simple "I need space" conversation would suggest. She wanted half the house, half my savings, a share of assets that predated our marriage entirely, and vague spousal support clauses that made little sense given her own strong income. This wasn't the request of someone processing heartbreak. This read like a strategy document, specific, aggressive, clearly assembled with legal input and, I suspected, personal encouragement from someone with a very particular interest in how much money ended up in her hands. Following the thread. I couldn't exactly ask Claire who this mystery friend was, so I had to get creative. I started with her social media. She'd never blocked me, and while she didn't post often, I began scrolling through tagged photos and old comment threads looking for a pattern. It didn't take long to find one. A guy named Derek showed up repeatedly, liking and commenting on her posts. Nothing explicit, nothing that would raise eyebrows on its own, but frequent enough that I clicked through to his profile. Public account, 30-something, worked in marketing, seemed unremarkable at first glance. Then I noticed a photo he'd posted from a cafe, the same cafe I'd seen Claire outside of weeks earlier, on what looked like the same day I'd overheard that strange phone call. My stomach turned. I kept scrolling and found more small threads, a comment on one of her photos that read "You've got this," a selfie he'd posted that, based on the background, appeared to have been taken inside what looked like a newly furnished apartment that wasn't ours. None of it was hard evidence. But it was enough to make the shape of the situation much clearer. I decided to reach out to a couple of mutual friends who'd known Claire for years, hoping someone might know something about this friend she'd mentioned. The first friend, Rachel, shut the conversation down almost immediately, claiming she had no idea what I was talking about and didn't want to get involved. Her defensiveness felt disproportionate to an innocent question. The second friend, Sarah, was hesitant at first too, giving vague, evasive answers before ending the call abruptly. I sat there afterward, more frustrated than ever, assuming that line of inquiry was dead. Then, to my surprise, Sarah called back that same evening. She said she needed to be sure whatever she told me wouldn't come back to her, and once I assured her it wouldn't, she finally opened up. Claire, she said, had been spending a significant amount of time with a guy named Derek from her office, and from what Sarah had heard secondhand, Derek had been actively involved in encouraging and guiding Claire through the divorce process. Hearing that name confirmed match up with the profile I'd found felt like the last piece of a puzzle sliding into place. This wasn't just an emotional unraveling. Someone had been steering it from behind the scenes, and I intended to find out exactly how deep that involvement went. Confirmation. That Saturday, I drove to Claire's temporary apartment and parked down the block, telling myself I just needed to see it with my own eyes before I let the suspicion fully settle into certainty. A few hours later, Claire and Derek walked out of the building together. They weren't holding hands, weren't doing anything overtly damning, but the closeness in how they walked, leaning into each other mid-conversation, comfortable in a way that spoke of familiarity built over more than a few casual work lunches, told me everything I needed to know. They got into his car together and drove off. I didn't follow them. I didn't need to. Sitting there in my car, staring at the empty space where they'd been standing, the entire picture clicked into focus. This wasn't a woman who had simply stopped loving her husband and needed space to rediscover herself. This was a woman who had already built the outline of her next chapter, with someone else, and was using the divorce not as an ending but as a stepping stone toward it. The distancing, the sudden obsession with our finances, the aggressive settlement demands, the coached language about sacrifice and deserving more, it all made sense now as pieces of a single coordinated plan. She wasn't trying to leave me. She was trying to leave me with nothing, cushioned by someone else's encouragement the whole way. I drove home that night with my head spinning, the betrayal settling into something colder and more focused than heartbreak. It hurt, of course it did, but underneath the hurt was a growing sense of clarity. She had no idea what I'd already done. She had no idea that the very foundation her aggressive settlement demands were built on no longer existed in the way she assumed it did. The mediation. The first mediation session was tense from the moment we sat down. Claire's attorney arrived with a binder thick enough to make you think we were negotiating a corporate merger rather than the end of a 5-year marriage. He ran through her list of demands like they were the most reasonable thing in the world: half the house, half my savings, portions of assets I'd owned before we even met, and those strange spousal support clauses that made little financial sense given her own income. I sat quietly through the entire presentation, letting my attorney handle the response. When it was finally our turn, Tom slid a folder across the table. "Before we go any further," he said calmly, "I think it's important everyone reviews these." Claire's attorney picked up the documents, and I watched his confident posture deflate page by page. "What is this?" he asked, looking up at Tom with a furrowed brow. "These documents confirm the transfer of the major marital assets into an irrevocable trust," Tom said, his tone even and unbothered. The transfers were completed several weeks prior to the divorce filing. Everything is fully legal, notarized, and dated. The room went quiet. Claire's attorney turned to her, visibly frustrated. "You didn't mention this." She grabbed the papers out of his hands, flipping through them with growing disbelief, her face flushing as the notarized signatures and timestamps confirmed exactly what Tom had said. "This can't be real," she muttered, before turning to look at me, her expression shifting from confusion to fury. "You planned this," she said. "You knew I was going to file, and you set this up to screw me over." I didn't respond. I let her sit with the reality of the documents in front of her, let her lawyer explain, slowly and clearly, exactly how airtight the timeline and paperwork were. There was nothing left to challenge. The dates aligned perfectly with a transfer that predated any indication of legal proceedings, meticulously advised by an experienced family attorney who had clearly seen this scenario play out before and made sure every detail was bulletproof. "You're unbelievable," she said, leaning forward, practically shaking. "I can't believe you'd do this to me." I still didn't say anything. What was there to say? This wasn't an act of revenge. It was self-preservation in response to a plan she'd already set in motion long before I made a single move. The session ended with her attorney requesting time to reassess their approach, though everyone in the room understood there wasn't much left to reassess. As we walked out, Claire pulled me aside in the hallway, her expression somewhere between rage and desperation. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "You're going to regret this." "I already regret trusting you," I told her. "That's the only regret I have." The unraveling. Everything accelerated after that mediation session. The calls started almost immediately, dozens of them, alternating wildly in tone. Some voicemails were soft and remorseful. "I think we just need to talk. I know this got messy, but we can fix it." Others, especially once I stopped responding, turned sharp and accusatory, blaming me for being cold, calculating, cruel, for everything that had apparently gone wrong in her life over the past several years. When the call stopped working, she shifted tactics entirely. Mutual friends started telling me she'd been describing the whole divorce as some kind of misunderstanding, even claiming at one point it had all been some sort of test of our relationship that had gone too far. The story didn't hold up under any scrutiny. If it was a test, people asked her, why hire a lawyer? Why file real legal paperwork with specific, aggressive financial demands? When people pushed back, she doubled down, recasting herself as the victim, someone whose trust had been broken by my reaction rather than the other way around. For a little while, it seemed to work on a few people. I got the occasional awkward message from an acquaintance implying they hadn't realized things were so difficult for her. Even her brother reached out at one point, telling me I should have just talked it out instead of taking such drastic action. It was frustrating, but I knew the full picture would surface eventually. It did, thanks to a mutual friend I'll call Mike. Mike and I weren't especially close, but we'd always gotten along. A few weeks after the mediation, he reached out unexpectedly, saying he had something I needed to see. When we met up, he showed me a string of text messages between Claire and Derek that a mutual contact of theirs had passed along, someone who'd grown uneasy watching Derek openly brag about how he was helping Claire secure her future at my expense. That mutual friend had felt guilty staying silent and eventually sent screenshots to Mike, hoping he'd know how to get them to me. The messages were damning. Claire wasn't just processing a difficult divorce in these texts, she was actively strategizing with Derek about maximizing what she could extract from the settlement. One message read something to the effect of needing him to hold firm so she could get everything she needed. Derek's replies encouraged her not to back down, to lean into guilt if necessary, framing the whole thing as something I owed her, with promises about starting fresh together once the money came through. Reading through them, sitting across from Mike, the full shape of the plan finally came into focus without any ambiguity left. This wasn't heartbreak. This wasn't someone falling out of love and needing space. This was a coordinated, calculated extraction plan, dressed up in the language of self-discovery and deserving more. The fallout. The texts didn't stay contained for long. Mike shared them with a small circle of mutual friends, and from there the story spread quickly. Claire's carefully constructed narrative collapsed almost overnight. People who had previously been sympathetic or at least neutral began quietly distancing themselves once they saw, in her own words, exactly how calculated the whole situation had been. By the time the divorce was finalized, she walked away with essentially just her personal belongings. Her attorney quietly withdrew most of the original demands once it became clear there was no legal ground to stand on. The trust structure Tom had built was airtight, and every aggressive claim from the initial filing had nowhere left to go. Derek, predictably, disappeared from the picture almost as soon as it became obvious there wasn't a financial windfall waiting at the end of this plan. I don't know the full story of what he told her, but based on everything I saw, it wouldn't surprise me if he'd been using her ambitions as much as she'd been using mine. Without him in her corner, her confidence collapsed. The calls kept coming for a while, but the tone shifted from anger to something closer to desperation. "Can we just talk, please?" one voicemail said. "I'll do anything to fix this." Another simply asked if we could find a way to settle things and move on without any further conflict. I didn't respond to any of it. There wasn't anything left to say, and there was no version of this where going back made sense. Even her family started to pull away once the full picture became clear. Her brother reached out again, this time with an apology, telling me he regretted taking her side without knowing the whole story. It wasn't much, but it confirmed that the truth had finally caught up to the version of events she'd been telling people. Resolution and outro. As for me, I kept the house, kept my savings, and more importantly, got something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace of mind. My mother, true to form, showed up with paint cans and a list of ideas to help me make the house feel like mine again rather than a space still haunted by the marriage that had fallen apart inside it. Looking back, I don't feel guilty about protecting myself the way I did. I think about it now the same way Tom framed it that first phone call: if nothing had been wrong, moving those assets would have cost me nothing at all. But something was wrong, and because I trusted a quiet, persistent instinct instead of dismissing it as paranoia, I walked away from that marriage with my future intact instead of gutted. I don't know what happened to Derek. I don't particularly care. And Claire, wherever she is now, exists as a closed chapter one have no interest in revisiting. The version of the future she and Derek had been quietly building together never had a chance to materialize the way they'd planned, and honestly, that's the only justice I needed out of this whole situation. If there's one thing I'd want anyone watching this to take away, it's this: trust your gut when something feels off, even when you can't fully explain why. You don't need airtight proof to justify protecting yourself. Sometimes the quiet, persistent unease you keep trying to talk yourself out of is exactly the thing you should be listening to. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way through. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell so you never miss one of these real-life stories of betrayal, resilience, and karma finding its way back around. Drop a comment below and let us know what you would have done in this situation. We'll see you in the next one.